Welcome to Code Chat. We are really glad that you are taking some time out of your day to join us. I am Amy Dean. I'm the Vice President of Operations for SC Codeworks, and a lot of what I focus on is helping teams step back and look at how their systems are supporting or maybe limiting the way that they run their operations. And this topic today is one that comes up constantly.
And I'm Tony Baldwin, the Director of Pre-Sales and Implementation. I usually get pulled in when there's a team that is either evaluating a new WMS or trying to figure out why their current one isn't quite keeping up anymore. And what's interesting is a lot of the time, it's not a dramatic failure that brings them in. It's more of a feeling that something's off or things are just harder than they should be.
And that's really why we wanted to do this topic today, really more conversational, less of a formal webinar, because what we're talking about are not black and white situations. It's a lot of gray area, a lot of this kind of works, but maybe not as well as it should. So we're going to talk through what we see pretty candidly, just based on real situations that we've both been in.
And this is basically the conversation we end up having behind the scenes anyway. So we figured we'd just talk about it with you.
Exactly. So let me start this with just a really simple question, and it's one that everybody's probably heard before, but I really challenge you to think about your answer for a second. In your gut, do you trust your inventory numbers right now, today?
Yeah, not the automatic one, the real one. We want to, because most people we ask will say, oh yeah, right away. 100%. But there's actually usually a pause where they start qualifying. It turns into yes, but we do like double check certain things, or yes, but we can't really rely on everything. And then that hesitation, that's where the interesting stuff begins.
Right. Whenever there's a yes, but it tends to reveal a lot, because if you're double checking, or if there's certain scenarios where you are not fully relying on your WMS, then you already have a gap. And, sometimes that gap feels manageable. It doesn't feel like a big enough reason to do anything about it. And that's really where things can get risky.
Right. And it just becomes part of the routine. But when you take a step back, the bigger question we usually ask is, okay, even if you trust your numbers, are they actually helping you with decisions quickly, or is there still friction between getting the information and, doing something with it?
Sometimes that's where we start to see teams realize that even after their daily cycle counts, they're still pulling reports and having to ask somebody on the floor to confirm what they already see. It's basically just adding extra steps before they have that confidence to act.
Exactly. And most of the times these things are small and manageable, but when you stack them across a day or a week, they can create a lot of friction in the operation. And that friction is usually where we're uncovering and, we start digging in.
That's where we wanted to start today, or that's what we wanted to talk about today. And we want to give you just a really simple way to step back and look at that. So we're going to walk through just kind of a quick WMS health check, not to tell you that you should replace your system, but this is just to help you figure out whether it's really supporting you the way that it should be, or if maybe you've just gotten used to working around it. Tony, do you remember there's an old commercial for some kind of air freshener or something, and they do the whole thing about how you become nose blind to certain scents? Do you remember that?
Yeah. And if nothing else, this should give you a clearer sense where things stand today and whether or not it's worth starting to ask some of the bigger questions.
Absolutely. So let's start with why teams miss this problem. So one of the biggest reasons that these problems can be so hard to spot is because for most teams, nothing feels obviously broken. It's not like the orders aren't going out or inventory isn't being tracked. Everything is moving. And from the outside, it can look like things are working just fine. And that creates a sense of stability that can actually be a little misleading.
Yeah. And I think that's the key point. Most environments we walk into, they're not chaotic. They're actually pretty controlled, pretty consistent. People know what they're doing. Processes are defined. And because of that, there's an assumption that things are flowing the way they're supposed to through the system.
Right, but consistency and effectiveness are not the same thing. And you can still be consistent and underperforming, or just carrying certain inefficiencies that no one's really questioning anymore.
Right. But most often, these inefficiencies didn't start as big problems. They started as small limitations within the team that they just adapted over time. And that adaptation is what makes them hard to see later because they stop feeling like issues and start feeling like the way things work.
Right. We've worked with, there was a warehouse that was speeding a production line. And I think this is a really good example of that, because,
Hmm.
when you look at their operation at a high level, nothing looked broken. Their inventory was moving, the line was being supplied, maybe a little bit slow, but it was. Everything seemed relatively stable. And when you dug into it, their lead times were a lot longer than they actually should have been. And not just slightly longer. It was significant enough that it was impacting their ability to hit targets. And what stood out was that nobody was really challenging it. It had been that way for so long that it just became the baseline that everybody planned around.
Amy, I remember this too. They essentially built their entire operation to accommodate that delay. So instead of asking the question, why aren't we hitting our quota? The question became, what do we do to add, what do we need to add to hit the quota?
Right. And that's such an important distinction because at that point, your system isn't supporting your operation. You are having to shape your operation and change based on the system's limitations.
Right. But the tricky part about it is that it doesn't feel like it's a failure. It feels like optimization. It feels like the team's doing a good job managing the constraints that they have. They feel like, they're winning the battle, but it wasn't a battle they shouldn't even be in.
Exactly. And, they were doing a good job, which made it even harder to spot the underlying issue because even though they weren't hitting all of their goals, they were consistent. And that consistency gave them this false sense of confidence that everything was under control.
But in reality, well, they were just repeating the same outcome over and over again. And without stepping back, there really wasn't a trigger to question it.
And, we see that same pattern show up in other ways too. Workarounds are probably the most obvious example. Wherever you start to see spreadsheets or manual trackers or even additional systems starting to fill in the gaps.
Yeah. And those are usually, the start of quick fixes. And, they're well intentioned. Someone builds something like a cool macro to solve a specific problem and it works, so it sticks. But over time, the tools become part of the process. Now, the real work is happening outside of the WMS.
Right. And at that point, the system becomes just more of a record keeping tool than an operational driver, which isn't what you want out of a WMS.
Well, the other version of this that we see a lot is around reporting. So most systems technically have the data you need, but if it takes too long to get or it's not presented in a way that is actionable, they stop relying on it.
And, when that happens, decisions start being driven more by experience and instinct than by actual real-time data. And again, that works for a while, especially with those experienced teams. It just doesn't scale well, and it definitely doesn't adapt well when things do change.
It works until something shifts. Volumes, customers, complexity, and then all those hidden gaps start to show fast.
It's overwhelming quick. So when you step back and look at all of this, the common thread is really pretty simple. If your system is only helping you repeat what you did yesterday without helping you to improve or adapt, then it's probably a sign just to dig a little deeper.
Mhm. When we start breaking that down, there's a few specific patterns that show up almost every time. So let's jump into some of those common WMS traps next.
And, an important point here is that nobody is intentionally setting themselves up for a bad outcome with their WMS. There are a lot of smart teams making logical decisions with the information that they have. The challenge is just that those decisions are often made in a very specific moment in time.
That's very true. So one of the most common ways that shows up when, a system is built or selected around the business needs of today, without a lot of consideration of, what's going to change. And again, that's completely understandable. You're focusing on solving immediate problems. You're thinking about the current order volume, the current customers, current workflow, and trying to make something that fits cleanly as possible.
Right. And in that moment, it feels like you've made a really good decision. The system aligns well with your operation, your team understands it, and things do start to run more smoothly. What tends to happen, though, is that even small changes, like introducing a new channel or adding a new customer, and even bigger ones like expanding into another facility, those start to put pressure on that original setup in ways that maybe you couldn't anticipate at the time.
And that is usually when we start asking questions like, what actually happens when you introduce that kind of change? So does the system adapt easily, or does it require a lot of manual effort or reconfiguration just to make it function? So because if it's the latter, that's a sign that the system really wasn't built for ongoing evolution. It was pretty much built for a snapshot in time.
And that's when teams really start to feel that friction that we were talking about earlier. It's not because something is fundamentally broken, but because the system just doesn't have that flexibility to grow alongside their business. So instead, the team has to absorb that complexity. And over time, it just becomes harder and harder to manage.
Right. So another pattern we see is letting cost be the primary driver in the decision-making process. And to be clear, cost should absolutely be a factor. It's important, but the main factor, and it tends to narrow the scope. When it's the main factor, it tends to narrow the scope of what you're actually evaluating.
Of course, we hear something like this all the time. We don't need anything too complex. We just need something simple that works. And again, that mindset, it makes sense, especially if you're trying to move quickly or stay within a certain budget. But what often gets overlooked is the real definition of simple and what that means 6 months down the road, a year down the road.
And in many cases, simple ends up becoming limited. So, it means fewer capabilities, less flexibility, more reliance on manual processes to fill in the gaps, and those gaps, they don't always show up immediately.
No, they don't. But when they do show up, it's tricky because they might not look like system issues at first. They could look like just doing an additional check, or we just need to coordinate more between our team. And over time, all of that adds up to a pretty significant amount of effort that the system was supposed to eliminate in the first place.
Exactly. And that's where the real costs, start to emerge. Not the price of the software, but in the way your team has to operate around it. We've seen situations when a system looked like it was the more cost-effective option up front, but within a year, the operational inefficiencies completely outweighed the initial savings.
Such an important point because, those costs are not always a line item. They can show up as slower decision making or just an overall drag on the operation. And in the long run, those things turn out to be even more expensive than, that tier 1 WMS. The third pattern that we see is almost the opposite of underbuying, but it leads to a very similar outcome, and that is over customization. So this usually comes from a place of trying to make the system fit your operation perfectly, especially when you have a key customer that is very specific workflow that you're trying to support.
And it's a slippery slope. And it often starts small. You make a few adjustments to handle a particular requirement, and it works well, so you keep going. But over time, those adjustments layer on top of each other, and the system becomes increasingly tailored to a very specific set of conditions.
The challenge with that is that it reduces that flexibility. The more customized the system becomes, the harder it is to adapt when something does change, and something always changes, right? Customers evolve, your requirements change, and, most often business priorities move in different directions.
That's true. That's true. So one of the questions we like to ask in any of those situations is, what happens if that key customer changes the requirements, or if they leave altogether? How much of your system would you need to be reworked to adjust? So, because if the answer is a significant portion, that's a sign that systems become too tightly coupled to something that isn't stable.
And, at that point, the system is not that it's just customized, it's fragile. It can work very well under very specific conditions, but if it doesn't handle that those changes, it creates hesitation within your team, and people, they naturally become more cautious about making any type of decisions or adjustments because they know how complex and time consuming those changes can be. So they, accept the status quo.
Right. And again, as we mentioned earlier, when the hesitation sets in, it slows everything down. Instead of a continuously improving and adapting, they focus on, shifts to maintaining and what already exists. And if it's no longer the best fit for the business, it's probably not worth doing.
When you can step back and look at all of the patterns together, it's good to note, like we mentioned earlier, that business is going to change. It's inevitable. It's the only constant that we've got is change. And you're going to add complexity. You are most likely going to take on new opportunities. And the question isn't whether, that change is going to happen. It's whether you can make those changes in your WMS seamlessly. So, around here in the conversation is usually where we start having teams ask, okay, how do I actually evaluate this in a simple way? Because when you're in it every day, it's hard to step back and see those patterns clearly.
But that's actually why we started putting together what we call the 15-minute WMS health check. So it's not meant to be a deep audit or anything heavy. The key is that you can kind of run us through your mind, and just walk through all the processes. So you don't need to pull a bunch of reports or prepare anything. It's more about, a quick way to pressure test what you're experiencing day to day and see if there's any obvious gaps.
So we're going to take a look at a few of those questions together here today. And, the first question, and we touched on this earlier, is can you trust your inventory without double checking it? And what we mean by that is if the system tells you that something is there, are you confident enough to act on it immediately? Or do you still have a step where somebody needs to verify it before anything else can move forward?
Right. But remember, there's always exceptions, like certain locations are on hold for product, or some SKUs have different pallet ties depending on the manufacturing. However, those exceptions, can point to bigger problems or bigger patterns.
A good clue to look for are the places where people are already starting to build in those extra checks. Things that are adding time, things that are making them hesitate, because that's where you start to see the system lose its effectiveness.
The second question we like to ask is how long it actually takes to act on a report. Not how long it takes to generate the report, but from the moment you see something to the moment you do something about it, what does that process look like?
A lot of teams have access to a lot of data. They can see what's happening, but we see a delay in being able to turn that into a decision or to make a change on the warehouse floor. And, because it's second nature, a lot of teams don't even realize that they have a delay.
Right. But, delays can be attributed to a number of things, such as the data needs to be interpreted or validated or shared with somebody else first. Over time, that creates lag, reduces how valuable the information actually is.
The third question is around workarounds. So are you relying on anything outside of your WMS to get the job done? And this is usually where things, start to get interesting because almost every team has something.
Oh, yeah. I've seen spreadsheets, highlighters, but by far spreadsheets are the biggest one that we hear most often, or, even shared documents or manual trackers. My least favorite is when a certain process lives in someone's head because the system can't handle it.
Yes, that one gets tricky. And teams essentially, when they do that, they build parallel systems out of manual processes just to make up for gaps in the WMS. And again, they're often really practical solutions in the moment. But when those become part of your core process, it's just a sign that your WMS isn't covering everything that it needs to be.
That's amen to that one. So, we put together a more structured version of this health check. So, something you can actually walk through step by step and use it with your team. We will include it. We'll include it in a link in the comments on this video. So check it out. See what, if your answers align.
And remember, the goal with these questions is not to score yourself perfectly. It's just to help you get a clearer picture. So before we wrap up, we did want to spend a few minutes on some of the questions that we see and we get a lot of times. A lot of these things we hear pretty regularly, so we wanted to pull a few together that we thought would be helpful to talk through.
Yeah, and these are great because they're usually questions people are already thinking about. They don't just always get asked out loud.
Exactly. So one of the most common questions that we get, and honestly, we hear this all the time, is can't we just optimize what we already have? And, it's because replacing a system is a big step. So, Tony, how do you usually think about that?
Yeah. And most teams should start there. You should absolutely look at it whether you're getting everything you can out of your current system before considering anything new. So the challenge is that there's a point where the optimization turns into compensation, and it's not always obvious at first.
Right, because both can look like improvement on the surface, right? Mm-hmm. Just adjusting workflows, adding steps, refining your processes.
But with true optimization, the system is doing more than, more of the work as you improve things. With compensation, your team's doing more of the work to make up for what the system can't handle. So, and over time, that creates more effort, more complexity, more reliance on people instead of the system.
That's a good distinction. So another question that we, get asked pretty frequently is how do you know when customization has gone too far? Because, most teams out there, they customize at least a little bit. That's pretty standard.
Yeah. And customization isn't inherently bad. In a lot of cases, it's necessary. Obviously, where it becomes a problem is when it starts limiting your ability to change instead of enabling it. Right. And one of the clearest signs is how difficult it is to make small adjustments.
So like when something that you feel like should be pretty simple starts to feel like a big lift.
Exactly. So if every change requires a lot of effort, a lot of coordination, a lot of risk, that usually means the system has become too tightly coupled. And another big signal is, when your setup is heavily built around a specific customer or workflow, if that changes or disappears, and your system struggles to adapt, that's when you probably know you've gone too far.
I guess that's where flexibility becomes more important than precision. It's not just about, today, it's the future too.
Right.
So another one that I like because it's a very practical question is what is the biggest red flag that you tend to notice early on? So Tony, when you first start talking to a team, what stands out?
Probably one of the fastest indicators is when the process starts being explained outside of the system. When people say things like, well, we track it on the spreadsheet, or, we have a separate way of handling that, or the person usually takes care of that piece. It tells you pretty quickly the system's missing something pretty important.
Right. So those real processes are living somewhere else.
Exactly. And the more of those you find, the more it points to a bigger pattern. Just saying. So another early signal is hesitation around data. When people don't fully trust what they're seeing, or they feel like they need to validate it before they're acting on it, that usually points to a foundational issue that's affecting everything else.
Right. And, when that trust starts to erode, it really can impact decision making across the board. Mm-hmm. So one more that I do think is worth talking about, because it, is on people's minds, even if it's not always phrased as directly as this. How do you know when it's time to start seriously evaluating new options, not just thinking about it, but really taking that next step forward?
Yeah, I think the key difference there is, when the issues you're seeing are no longer isolated, right? So they start showing up across multiple areas of the operation. It's not, just an inventory thing or just a reporting thing or just one workflow. It's a pattern of friction that, keeps coming up in different ways.
So you're saying it starts to feel more systematic instead of just situational.
Exactly. And another big indicator is when the effort required to maintain or improve, what you've started outweighs the benefit. If your team is spending a significant amount of time managing the system, working around it, trying to fix recurring issues, it's usually a sign you're reaching a tipping point.
Yeah, and at that point, you're not really just talking about fixing one specific thing. You're starting to ask yourself whether the system itself is still the right foundation.
Right. And that's the start of the evaluation early. Before things become urgent, gives you a lot more control over the outcome. You can be more thoughtful, more strategic, and avoid making decisions under pressure.
That's such a good point. Thank you for answering some of those questions for us today, Tony. Hopefully that gives a little more context around how to think through some of these decisions. I think that's really the goal of conversations like these. It's not to create urgency just for the sake of it. It's just to look at things through a clearer lens and, spark conversations to look at your operation and decide if things are working as well as they should be.
Exactly. And if you go through this and everything feels solid, that's great. You've got a confirmation that your system is supporting you. But if you found yourself hesitating on some of these questions and recognize some of these patterns, that's usually a sign it's worth taking a closer look.
Exactly. And, don't forget about the WMS health check that we talked about. It'll be in the comments. And, we're always here if you'd like to reach out and talk through your specific questions. We appreciate you joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And please reach out if we can help you in any way.